Today, we are diving into one of the most famous assassinations in all of history, the death of Julius Caesar. But our memory of this whole event has been shaped way more by a playwright than by any historian. And it's in the gap between those two where the real story is hiding. I mean, come on, it is one of the most iconic lines ever written, right? It's just this perfect, gut-wrenching summary of betrayal, all packed into three little words. It's so famous, it feels like it has to be real.
And that is our jumping off point. Because what we find in the space between great drama and actual messy history is a much deeper truth about power, about politics, and, as we'll see, about the incredible art of persuasion. So here's how we're going to get to the bottom of this. First, we're going to pry apart the drama from the history. Then we'll look at how Shakespeare basically sculpted his characters to fit his story. We will break down what might be the most powerful speech in the entire play, and then we'll jump back to his original source, the historian Plutarch. And finally, we'll meet the one guy who maybe understood the stakes better than anyone else, but was pretty much left on the cutting room floor.
Okay, first things first, we have to get our heads around the idea that there are two very different ways of telling the truth.
So a historian's first job is to stick to the facts, right? The evidence, the records, what actually happened. But a dramatist, someone like Shakespeare, they've got a totally different goal. Their job is to show us something true about ourselves, about things like ambition and loyalty and betrayal. So yeah, his main source was the historian Plutarch, but Shakespeare was never afraid to bend the facts if it helped him get to that deeper, more human truth.
All right, let's see how this actually plays out. Shakespeare took real historical figures and, well, he kind of sharpened their edges, turning these really complex people into perfect characters for a tragedy. So take Gaius Cassius. In the play, he is a straight-up villain who's just driven by pure jealousy. Caesar even famously says he has a lean and hungry look. But the real Cassius? He was a respected military officer who had very real, very genuine political reasons to fear Caesar's rise to power. Shakespeare boils him down to a simple schemer, and he does that to make our next guy look a whole lot better.
And what about Caesar himself? Well, Shakespeare paints him as this incredibly arrogant guy who's almost daring fate to come at him, ignoring every single warning. The historical Caesar was way more complicated. He was a brilliant politician, a commander so beloved by his soldiers that they would literally follow him anywhere. By cranking up his pride, Shakespeare makes the assassination feel, well, almost justified. And this brings us to Brutus, the tragic hero of the story. Shakespeare gives us this pure idealist, right? The noblest Roman of them all, who kills his friend for the good of Rome. But Plutarch tells us his motives were a lot messier. He owed Caesar money, he'd even been pardoned by him in the past. Shakespeare simplifies all of that to give us the absolute heart of the tragedy. A good man doing a terrible thing for what he truly believes are the right reasons.
Now, after Caesar is killed, the entire play pivots on one single moment that Shakespeare pretty much invented from scratch, Mark Antony's funeral speech. And with these famous words, Antony launches into one of the most brilliant, most manipulative pieces of rhetoric ever put to paper. Here's the crazy part. Plutarch just tells us that Antony gave a speech. That's it. He never recorded a word of what was said. Shakespeare saw that blank space and created a masterpiece. To really understand what he pulls off here, you need to know a little bit about rhetoric, the art of persuasion. The Romans took this stuff very seriously. You could appeal to logic, which they called logos. You could appeal to your own credibility and character, or ethos. Or you could go straight for the heart and appeal to the crowd's emotions, which is pathos. Antony, he's about to use all three. And just watch his strategy here. It's not random. He sequences these appeals perfectly. First, he builds his credibility, his ethos, by saying, hey, I'm not even here to praise Caesar. He sounds humble, trustworthy. Then he hits them with logic, logos, giving them evidence, like how Caesar refused the crown 3 times. And only then, only when he's got the crowd leaning his way, does he unleash the raw emotion, the pathos, showing them the bloody toga and reading Caesar's will. And here it is, the knockout punch. He keeps repeating that Brutus is an honorable man over and over and over again until the words themselves become poison. With every repetition, it drips with more and more sarcasm, turning the crowd from cheering for Brutus to wanting his blood. It's just a terrifying masterclass in how to weaponize language.
So if Shakespeare was inventing so much, what did the original source actually say? Let's take a look at the historian he was reading, Plutarch.
Now, Plutarch wasn't a modern historian in the way we think of one. He was what you'd call a moral biographer. He was writing more than a century after Caesar died, and his goal wasn't just to list facts. It was to teach his readers lessons about good and bad character, using these famous men as examples. And his picture of Caesar is really different. Just listen to this. He describes a leader who inspired such insane loyalty that his regular soldiers became these unstoppable heroes just for him. This is not the arrogant tyrant from the play. This is a general who genuinely earned the love and respect of his men. And that brings us to our final figure, the one man who probably understood the idea of the Republic better than anyone, and who is, ironically, totally dismissed in Shakespeare's play. See, in the play, the conspirators float the idea of bringing the famous senator Cicero into their plot. But Brutus immediately shoots it down. He says Cicero's too proud, that he'd never follow a plan someone else started.
And that is one of the most staggering ironies in all of history. Because in real life, absolutely nobody fought harder or argued more passionately for the Roman Republic than Marcus Tullius Cicero. He practically wrote the book on it.
To Cicero, a republic wasn't just a building full of senators and a bunch of laws. No, it was a moral agreement. It was a community that was held together by a shared belief in justice and doing what's right for everyone. And he argued that the second peoples start caring more about their own little faction or their favorite general than that big idea, the republic is already dead.
And for that belief, Cicero paid the ultimate price. After Caesar's death, Mark Antony hunted him down. Plutarch describes his murder in this absolutely chilling detail. They cut off his head, and they cut off the hands that wrote those fiery speeches against Antony, and they nailed them up in the public square for all of Rome to see. The message was brutal and clear. The Republic and the man who defended it were done.
So, at the end of the day, we have 3 completely different windows into the exact same story. Shakespeare gives us this powerful, timeless human tragedy. Plutarch gives us the messy, complicated, morally gray history. And Cicero, the guy who's just a footnote in the play, he gives us the huge political idea that was really at stake the whole time.
Which brings us right back to the central, timeless question that Shakespeare leaves hanging in the air. It's the dilemma that Brutus forces every single one of us to confront, and it is just as relevant today as it was in ancient Rome. Can you do a truly terrible thing for what you believe is a good reason and still call yourself noble?